Millionaire warned by a waitress. Don't go to the meeting. The next morning, a luxury car was parked near her humble home. Samantha adjusted her apron for what felt like the 100th time that night, brushing her hair back into a loose ponytail as she weaved between tables. The diner was alive with its usual buzz, clinking silverware, faint jazz music humming from the speakers, and the muffled chatter of customers enjoying their meals. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Samantha had worked here since she was 19, and though the long hours left her drained, she found comfort in the rhythm of the job. Tonight, though, something felt off. At the far corner of the diner, two men sat hunched over a table, their voices low but urgent. Samantha had noticed them the moment they walked in. They didn't fit the usual crowd. No warm smiles or casual conversations. Instead, their demeanor was tense, and the way they occasionally glanced around the room made her uneasy. Still, Samantha had learned long ago to mind her own business. Customers came and went, and it wasn't her place to judge. But as she refilled coffee cups and cleared plates, snippets of their conversation floated to her ears. Tomorrow morning, she won't see it coming, one of them muttered. It's perfect. She's too arrogant to suspect anything, the other replied. Smirking, Samantha frowned as she passed by, her heart thudding in her chest. Normally, she would have ignored it, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. But something about the way they spoke, and the name they mentioned, made her pause. Victoria Morgan. Everyone in Chicago knew who Victoria Morgan was. She was a powerful businesswoman, famous for her sharp instincts and even sharper tongue. Her face regularly graced the covers of business magazines, her success story a beacon for aspiring entrepreneurs. But she was also a polarizing figure, admired by some, despised by others, and tonight she was sitting just a few tables away, sipping on a glass of red wine as if she didn't have a care in the world. Samantha glanced at Victoria, her elegant posture radiating confidence. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit that screamed luxury, her sleek blonde hair falling perfectly around her shoulders. Samantha couldn't imagine two worlds more different than hers and Victoria's. Yet here they were, sharing the same diner. The men's words echoed in her mind. She won't see it coming. As Victoria stood up to leave, Samantha's pulse quickened. She debated with herself. Was she overreacting? It wasn't her place to interfere in a stranger's life, especially someone as untouchable as Victoria Morgan. But what if something really was wrong? Taking a deep breath, Samantha wiped her hands on her apron and hurried toward Victoria, catching her just before she reached the door. "Excuse me, Mrs. Morgan?" Samantha's voice wavered slightly, but she forced herself to meet Victoria's icy blue eyes. Victoria raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Yes." Samantha swallowed hard. "I know this is going to sound strange, but please don't go to any meetings tomorrow. I think something bad might happen." For a moment, Victoria simply stared at her, her expression unreadable. Samantha felt her cheeks burn, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. "Why would you say that?" Victoria finally asked, her tone calm but laced with suspicion. Samantha hesitated, glancing toward the two men in the corner. "Those two," she whispered, nodding subtly. "They were talking about you. I overheard them mention a meeting and it didn't sound right." Victoria followed her gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she turned back to Samantha, her eyes had narrowed. "I appreciate your concern, but I think I can handle myself," she said curtly. Without another word, she stepped out into the cool Chicago night, leaving Samantha standing by the door, her heart sinking. The next morning, Samantha couldn't shake the lingering unease as she walked to the diner for her shift. She replayed the encounter in her mind, doubting herself more with each step. Had she overstepped? Maybe Victoria had been right. Someone like her didn't need advice from a waitress. But as Samantha approached her apartment after work that evening, she froze. Parked near the curb was a sleek black car, the kind she'd only ever seen in magazines. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Victoria Morgan herself, looking as composed as ever. "Samantha, isn't it?" Victoria said, her voice steady but less cold than the night before. Yes," Samantha stammered, unsure of what to say. Victoria took a step closer, her expression softening just slightly. "I came to thank you. You were right. That meeting was a trap, and your warning saved me from walking straight into it." Samantha's jaw dropped. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Victoria replied. But I do have a question for you. How would you like a chance to change your life? The silence stretched between them as Samantha stood frozen on the sidewalk, trying to process what Victoria had just said. It wasn't every day that a millionaire in a designer suit showed up in your neighborhood, let alone offered you a chance to change your life. Victoria, ever composed, glanced around the modest street lined with aging brownstones and cracked sidewalks. Her polished appearance stood in stark contrast to the surroundings, making her seem almost otherworldly. Samantha felt a wave of embarrassment sweep over her, aware of the threadbare hoodie she was wearing and the scuffed sneakers on her feet. "I'm sorry," Samantha blurted out, her voice uneven. "I think you have the wrong person. I'm just a waitress." Victoria's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "I'm well aware of who you are, Samantha, and you're far more than just a waitress." She gestured toward the car. "Do you have a moment to talk? Somewhere more private, perhaps?" Samantha hesitated. This had to be some sort of elaborate prank, right? People like Victoria Morgan didn't show up unannounced in neighborhoods like hers. But the earnestness in Victoria's expression, subtle but present, gave Samantha pause. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Sure," Samantha said cautiously, following Victoria to the sleek car. The driver, a stone-faced man in a tailored black suit, opened the back door for them without a word. Samantha slid in first, her hands nervously clutching the strap of her worn canvas bag. The interior of the car was just as luxurious as she'd imagined. Smooth leather seats, a faint scent of expensive cologne, and the soft hum of an engine that was nearly silent. Samantha sat stiffly, feeling wildly out of place as Victoria settled gracefully beside her. The car pulled away from the curb, and Victoria turned to Samantha with an intensity that made her feel both seen and scrutinized. "I'll get straight to the point," Victoria began, her tone businesslike. "Your warning last night saved me from walking into a setup orchestrated by some of my competitors. If I had attended that meeting, I would have lost far more than just a business deal." Samantha blinked, trying to absorb the weight of what Victoria was saying. "What kind of setup?" she asked hesitantly. Victoria's gaze turned steely. They had forged documents, falsified evidence, everything needed to discredit me and my company. They planned to confront me in front of key stakeholders and the press, leaving me with no time to defend myself. It would have been a disaster. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. I didn't realize it was that serious," she stammered. Victoria leaned back slightly, crossing her legs. "Serious enough that I owe you a debt of gratitude," she said. "And that brings me to my proposition." Samantha tilted her head, wary but intrigued. "Proposition?" Victoria nodded. "I see potential in you, Samantha. Not just because of what you did last night, but because of the way you did it. Most people would have ignored those men or dismissed their conversation as gossip. But you didn't. You had the courage to approach me, someone you don't know, and warn me. That tells me you have intuition, boldness, and a good heart, traits I value." Samantha didn't know what to say. Her mind raced with questions. Why was Victoria doing this? What kind of proposition was she talking about? And why her, of all people? "I'm offering you a job," Victoria continued, her voice cutting through Samantha's thoughts. "Not as a waitress, but as my personal assistant." The words hung in the air, almost surreal. Samantha's mouth opened, then closed again as she struggled to form a coherent response. "Your assistant," she repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it more believable. "Yes," Victoria said simply. "It's not a glamorous role, but it's important. You'd handle schedules, correspondence, and a myriad of other tasks that require someone sharp and trustworthy. In return, you'll be fairly compensated, with benefits far beyond what you're earning now." Samantha stared at her, torn between disbelief and excitement. "But I don't have any experience with any of that," she admitted. "I've only ever worked at the diner." Victoria's expression softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of warmth in her voice. "Experience can be gained. Integrity and courage can't. Besides, I trust my instincts, and my instincts tell me you're exactly what I need." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. This was insane, like something out of a movie. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to grab hold of the lifeline Victoria was offering. But another part of her, the cautious, practical part, couldn't ignore the risks. "What if I screw it up?" she asked quietly, voicing her biggest fear. Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but I have a feeling you won't." The car slowed to a stop in front of the diner where Samantha worked. She hadn't even realized they'd been driving in circles. Victoria turned to her one last time. "Take the night to think it over," she said, handing Samantha a business card with her personal contact information. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come often." With that, the door opened, and Samantha stepped out onto the sidewalk, clutching the card like a lifeline. As the car pulled away, she looked down at the elegant black lettering on the card, Victoria Morgan. For the first time in her life, Samantha felt like maybe, just maybe, her world was about to change. Samantha sat at the small, chipped dining table in her tiny apartment, staring at Victoria's sleek black business card. The bold lettering gleamed under the dim light of the single bulb hanging overhead. The card felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of all her decisions. She had been replaying the conversation with Victoria over and over in her mind. Each word a mix of encouragement and daunting responsibility. Her roommate, Carla, shuffled into the kitchen, yawning and still in her pajamas even though it was well past noon. "What's with the existential crisis face?" Carla asked, pouring herself a mug of coffee from the half-empty pot on the counter. Samantha sighed, holding up the card. "Remember the lady I warned at the diner last night?" Carla raised an eyebrow as she plopped into the chair across from her. "The rich one, Victoria Morgan or whatever." "Yeah, she showed up outside the apartment this morning." Samantha paused for dramatic effect. "And offered me a job as her personal assistant." Carla froze, the mug halfway to her lips. "Are you serious? The Victoria Morgan wants you as her assistant? That's insane." "I know," Samantha replied, dropping her head into her hands. "I mean, who just offers a random waitress a job like that? It doesn't make sense." Carla shrugged. "Rich people do weird stuff all the time. Maybe she thinks you're her good luck charm or something." "It's not about luck," Samantha said, lifting her head. "She said she sees potential in me that I have. Intuition and courage." Carla let out a low whistle. "Sounds like she's got you all figured out." "Yeah, but what if she's wrong?" Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if I screw this up?" Carla leaned forward, her expression softening. "Sam, you've been working your butt off at that diner for years, putting up with rude customers and crappy pay. You deserve a shot at something better. Don't let self-doubt mess this up." Samantha stared at her roommate, the encouragement sinking in. Maybe Carla was right. Maybe this was her chance to prove she could be more than a waitress. By the time Samantha arrived at Victoria's office the next morning, her nerves were in overdrive. The building was a towering glass structure in the heart of Chicago's financial district, its facade reflecting the bustling city below. Samantha's modest outfit, a simple white blouse and black slacks, felt completely out of place amidst the sea of tailored suits and designer handbags swarming the lobby. "Name?" the receptionist asked, barely looking up from her computer. "Samantha Brooks," she replied, clutching the strap of her bag tightly. "I have a meeting with Victoria Morgan." The receptionist's eyebrows shot up, and she gave Samantha a once-over before picking up the phone. Moments later, a sharply dressed assistant appeared and led Samantha to the elevator. The ride to the top floor felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the machinery. Samantha's palms were damp with sweat, and she wiped them discreetly on her pants. When the elevator doors opened, Samantha was greeted by an office that could only be described as intimidatingly elegant. The floors were polished marble, and the walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. A massive desk sat at the center of the room, behind which Victoria Morgan herself stood, poised and regal as ever. "Samantha," Victoria said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "You're right on time. Come in." Samantha stepped forward hesitantly, feeling as though every movement was being scrutinized. Victoria gestured for her to sit in one of the sleek leather chairs in front of the desk. "Did you think about my offer?" Victoria asked, cutting straight to the point. "I did," Samantha replied, forcing herself to meet Victoria's gaze. "And I'd like to accept." Victoria's lips curved into a small smile. Good. Then let's get started. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the desk toward Samantha. This is your contract. Take your time reading it. But the gist is simple. You'll be my personal assistant. Your duties will range from managing my schedule to handling sensitive information. It will be demanding, but I believe you're capable. Samantha picked up the papers, her hands trembling slightly. The salary listed in bold at the top of the second page made her eyes widen. It was more than she'd ever dreamed of earning. This is generous, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Consider it an investment, Victoria replied, leaning back in her chair. I expect excellence, Samantha. In return, you'll be compensated fairly. Samantha nodded, swallowing hard. I'll do my best. Victoria's eyes softened. Just a fraction. I know you will. The rest of the day was a whirlwind. Samantha was introduced to several members of Victoria's team, each one more polished and intimidating than the last. She was shown her desk, a sleek, minimalist workspace just outside Victoria's office, and given an overview of her duties. It was overwhelming, but Samantha absorbed everything like a sponge, determined not to let her inexperience show. By the time the day ended, Samantha was exhausted but exhilarated. As she rode the train home, her mind buzzed with everything she'd learned. This was it, her chance to prove herself. To escape the monotony of her old life, she glanced down at the keycard in her hand, emblazoned with the Morgan Enterprises logo, and felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, Samantha allowed herself to believe that her life could truly change. Samantha arrived at Morgan Enterprises earlier than usual. Determined to make a strong impression on her second day, she'd spent most of the night poring over the employee handbook and reading up on corporate etiquette, wanting to prove to Victoria, and to herself, that she could rise to the challenge. The lobby was already buzzing with activity when she stepped inside. Employees in sharp suits moving briskly between meetings, coffee cups in hand. Samantha clutched her bag tightly, her nerves kicking in as she rode the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, she was greeted by the sight of her new desk, a sleek, glass-topped workspace that still felt foreign and intimidating. "Good morning, Samantha," came Victoria's sharp yet calm voice from her office doorway. She was impeccably dressed, as always, in a fitted gray blazer and heels that clicked against the marble floor as she approached. "I trust you're ready for today." Samantha nodded quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Morgan. I've gone through all the notes you gave me, and I'm ready to assist however I can." Victoria's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good, because today will be a test of how quickly you can adapt." Samantha's stomach dropped. A test. She hadn't anticipated that. "What kind of test?" she asked hesitantly. Victoria handed her a folder, the sleek black cover embossed with the Morgan Enterprises logo. "There's an investor meeting in 2 hours. I need you to prepare the presentation materials and ensure all the documents are in order. There can't be any mistakes." Samantha's heart raced as she took the folder. "Of course, I'll handle it." Victoria's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if assessing her resolve. "Remember, Samantha, precision is everything in this world. I'm trusting you to deliver." With that, Victoria turned and walked back into her office, leaving Samantha to stare at the folder in her hands. She took a deep breath and opened it, quickly scanning the contents. The documents were a mix of financial reports, market analyses, and strategic plans, all filled with jargon and figures that made her head spin. She bit her lip, fighting the wave of self-doubt threatening to overwhelm her. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, sitting down at her desk and powering up her computer. The next 2 hours flew by in a blur of spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides. Samantha worked with laser focus, double-checking every figure and formatting each slide to perfection. She was so engrossed in her task that she barely noticed the time until a voice interrupted her. "Is everything ready?" Victoria asked, standing beside her desk. Samantha looked up, startled. She hadn't even heard her approach. "Yes, I've reviewed everything twice. The presentation is on your tablet, and I've printed backup copies of all the documents." Victoria arched an eyebrow, impressed. "Efficient. Let's see if your preparation holds up." The meeting took place in a spacious conference room with a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Samantha stood to the side, clutching the backup documents while Victoria led the presentation with her trademark poise and confidence. As the investors fired off questions, Victoria answered them effortlessly, her tone measured and authoritative. Samantha watched in awe, marveling at how Victoria commanded the room. But her admiration was short-lived when one of the investors raised a question about a specific financial projection. Victoria glanced down at her tablet, her expression tightening. "This figure seems incorrect," the investor said, his tone laced with skepticism. "Can you clarify?" Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly which figure he was referring to, a projection she had spent nearly 20 minutes verifying. Had she missed something? Victoria turned her gaze toward Samantha, her eyes sharp. It wasn't an accusation, but it was clear she expected an answer. Samantha stepped forward, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her chest. "The projection is accurate," she said, holding up the backup document. "The discrepancy comes from the updated market trend analysis included in the appendix. If you turn to page 14, you'll see the detailed breakdown." The investor flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he scanned the data. After a moment, he nodded. "Ah, I see. That makes sense." Relief washed over Samantha, though she kept her composure. Victoria gave her a subtle nod of approval before continuing the presentation. When the meeting finally ended, Victoria approached Samantha as they walked back to the office. "You handled that well?" she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. Most people would have panicked under that kind of pressure. Samantha let out a small laugh, still riding the adrenaline from the encounter. "I was panicking on the inside." Victoria's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Never let them see it. That's the key," back at her desk. Samantha allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had survived her first major test, and even earned a sliver of Victoria's approval. But just as she began to relax, her computer pinged with an urgent email. The subject line read, "Security breach. Urgent action required." Samantha's stomach churned as she clicked on the email. The message detailed a potential leak of sensitive company information, one that could jeopardize a major deal Victoria had been working on for months. Samantha's pulse quickened as she realized the breach was tied to an earlier data report she had filed that morning. Her hands trembled as she stood and hurried toward Victoria's office. She knocked once before stepping inside, the urgency clear in her voice. "Miss Morgan, we have a problem." Victoria looked up from her desk, her expression immediately hardening. "What kind of problem?" Samantha handed her the email. "It's about the data report from earlier. There's a potential breach. And I think it might be my fault." Victoria's gaze bore into her, sharp and unyielding. For the first time since Samantha had started working there, she saw a flicker of anger in Victoria's eyes. "Explain," Victoria said coldly, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. Samantha swallowed hard. Knowing she was about to face her toughest challenge yet, Samantha stood frozen in Victoria's office, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. The email about the potential security breach sat on Victoria's sleek, polished desk, its subject line glaring up at them like a warning siren. Victoria's icy blue eyes locked onto Samantha, her expression unreadable but undeniably tense. "I asked for an explanation, Samantha," Victoria said, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. "What happened?" Samantha took a deep breath, her fingers clutching the edge of the folder she was holding. "The breach seems to be connected to the data report I submitted earlier this morning," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "There was an external attachment, a third-party data set, used for cross-referencing projections. I triple-checked the numbers, but I didn't think to verify the source of the file itself." Victoria's jaw tightened, and she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. The silence stretched, and Samantha could feel the weight of her mistake growing with each passing second. "So, you uploaded an unverified file into Morgan Enterprises' system," Victoria finally said, her tone measured but laced with disappointment. Samantha swallowed hard. "Yes, but I didn't realize it was unverified at the time. It looked legitimate and—" "That's not an excuse," Victoria interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "In this world, appearances mean nothing. Every detail, every source, every action must be meticulously vetted. Do you understand what's at stake here?" Samantha nodded quickly. "I do, and I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Victoria stared at her for a moment, her expression softening just a fraction. "Apologies won't fix it. Actions will. Sit down and figure out exactly where the breach originated. Contact it, and have them trace the source. If there's any chance this data has been compromised, I need to know who has it, how much they know, and how we can contain it. Samantha nodded again, the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightening as she hurried out of the office. Back at her desk, she immediately dialed the IT department, explaining the situation in rapid detail. The head of it, a no-nonsense woman named Carla Singh, assured her that they would begin an investigation immediately, but warned that it might take hours, or even days, to trace the breach fully. I need this done as quickly as possible, Samantha urged. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Just don't touch anything else, Carla replied dryly. We'll handle it. Samantha hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. She felt the weight of her mistake pressing down on her, but there was no time to dwell on her guilt. She needed to find a way to regain Victoria's trust. And fast, the rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of tension and frantic activity. Samantha reviewed every file she had worked on that day, combing through them for any signs of additional errors or vulnerabilities. By the time the IT department called back with an update, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the office. The breach was minor, Carla Singh said, her voice crackling through the speakerphone. It looks like the file was flagged by our system before it could do any real damage. No data was extracted, but the attempt was made through a shell company registered overseas. Samantha's heart lifted slightly at the news. So, it's contained. For now, Carla replied. But this wasn't a random attack. Someone targeted us. You need to be extra careful moving forward. Understood, Samantha said, relief washing over her. She hung up and immediately walked to Victoria's office to deliver the update. Victoria looked up as Samantha entered, her expression guarded. Well, the breach was contained, Samantha reported, her voice steadier this time. No data was stolen. It traced the source to a shell company overseas, but they're confident it didn't progress beyond an initial attempt. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she absorbed the information. So, we got lucky, Samantha hesitated. Yes, but I've learned my lesson. I'm implementing a new process for vetting files to ensure this doesn't happen again. I'll double-check every source moving forward, and I'll have it verify anything remotely suspicious. Victoria's gaze lingered on her, sharp and assessing. After a long pause, she nodded. Good. You made a mistake, but you handled the fallout well. That's what matters. Samantha exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, Ms. Morgan. I won't let it happen again. I'll hold you to that, Victoria said, her tone softer now. Mistakes are inevitable, Samantha. It's how you respond to them that sets you apart. For the first time since the ordeal began, Samantha felt a flicker of hope. Victoria's words, though stern, carried a note of encouragement that gave her the strength to keep pushing forward. The next morning, Samantha arrived at work with renewed determination. She was determined to prove herself, not just to Victoria, but to everyone who doubted her. As she settled into her desk, she noticed an email from Victoria in her inbox. The subject line read, Upcoming projects, review immediately. Opening it, Samantha found a list of high-priority tasks that Victoria had assigned to her, including managing a key client's portfolio and coordinating a meeting with a potential investor. The tasks were complex and demanding, but Samantha welcomed the challenge. It was a sign that Victoria still trusted her, and she was determined not to let her down again as she dove into the work. Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had faced her first major obstacle and come out stronger on the other side. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. For the first time since starting at Morgan Enterprises, Samantha felt like she truly belonged. Samantha's routine at Morgan Enterprises had begun to settle into a steady rhythm, though steady hardly meant calm. Each day presented a whirlwind of tasks, meetings, and unexpected challenges, but Samantha was determined to rise to the occasion. Every step forward felt like a small victory, a testament to her grit and adaptability. Yet, amidst the controlled chaos of her new life, a nagging question lingered in the back of her mind, the strange familiarity she'd felt in Victoria's world. It started small, an oddly familiar fragrance in the halls of Morgan Enterprises, a sense of déjà vu when she stepped into certain rooms. Samantha tried to dismiss it as her mind playing tricks, But the feeling was persistent, clawing at her thoughts. And then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, she stumbled upon something that turned her unease into curiosity. Samantha had been assigned to archive some older contracts stored in the executive suite's filing cabinets. Victoria, as meticulous as ever, insisted on keeping detailed records of every deal, and Samantha's task was to ensure everything was cross-referenced and digitized. The cabinets were massive, stretching nearly to the ceiling, with rows of meticulously labeled folders. She was halfway through her task when she noticed a folder sticking out slightly from the others, its tab faded and worn. Curious, Samantha pulled it free, her brow furrowing as she read the label. Morgan Estate. Staff Files. It was an unassuming title, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated, glancing around the empty office. The rational part of her mind told her to leave it alone. It wasn't relevant to her work, and Victoria would likely disapprove of her snooping. But another part of her, the part that couldn't shake the strange familiarity of her surroundings, urged her to open it. Against her better judgment, she flipped the folder open. Inside were neatly typed documents listing the names of household staff who had worked for the Morgan family over the years. Samantha scanned the pages, her pulse quickening as she spotted a familiar name, Evelyn Brooks. Her heart stopped. Evelyn Brooks was her mother's name. Samantha's hands trembled as she pulled the file closer, her eyes darting across the text. The document was a standard employment record, detailing her mother's position as a housekeeper for the Morgan family nearly 2 decades ago. It listed dates of employment, job responsibilities, and even a note of commendation for her dedication and professionalism. Samantha's mind raced. Why had her mother never mentioned this? She had always spoken vaguely about the jobs she'd worked before Samantha was born, but she had never once mentioned working for the Morgans. And why would she leave a position that, by all accounts, seemed stable and well-paying? She flipped to the next page, her breath catching as she found a letter addressed to Evelyn. It was brief and formal, signed by one of the Morgans' estate managers, thanking her for her service and informing her that her employment would be terminated due to unforeseen circumstances. The date on the letter matched the time her mother had abruptly moved them to a new city, when Samantha was just a toddler. The puzzle pieces didn't fit, and the more Samantha thought about it, the more questions arose. Had something happened during her mother's time working for the Morgans? And why had her mother kept this part of her life a secret? Samantha was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Victoria's footsteps until it was too late. "What are you doing?" Victoria's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Samantha's stomach twist. She looked up to see Victoria standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Samantha scrambled to close the folder, her cheeks flushing. I was archiving files. Victoria's eyes flicked to the folder in Samantha's hands, her jaw tightening slightly. "That doesn't look like the file you were supposed to be working on." "I'm sorry," Samantha said quickly, standing and holding the folder out to Victoria. "I saw my mother's name and I got curious. She worked for your family a long time ago." Victoria's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing her features, before she masked it with her usual composure. She took the folder from Samantha and set it aside on her desk. "Evelyn Brooks," she said slowly, as if trying to place the name. "Yes, I remember her." Samantha blinked, startled. "You do?" Victoria nodded, though her gaze seemed distant. "I was young at the time, but I remember she was kind, quiet, but hardworking. My mother spoke highly of her." The revelation sent a rush of emotions through Samantha. Gratitude, confusion, and a faint sense of unease. Why did she leave? Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know. My mother handled most of the household staff, and I wasn't involved in those decisions, but if it's something you want to look into, I won't stop you." Samantha wasn't sure how to respond. Victoria's permission felt both generous and unexpected, but the guarded look in her eyes suggested there was more to the story than she was letting on. "Thank you," Samantha said finally, her voice quiet. Victoria gave her a curt nod. "Finish archiving the files, and Samantha, be careful where your curiosity takes you." Not all questions lead to answers you'll like. With that, Victoria turned and walked out of the office, leaving Samantha standing alone with a storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. That night, Samantha lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling of her apartment. The name Evelyn Brooks echoed in her thoughts. Along with Victoria's cryptic warning, something about her mother's time with the Morgans didn't add up, and Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that digging into the past would uncover more than she was prepared for. But even as doubt crept in, so did resolve. Samantha had spent her whole life wondering about the parts of her mother's story that didn't make sense. Now, she had a chance to find answers, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her. Samantha spent the next few days in a state of quiet turmoil. By day, she threw herself into her work at Morgan Enterprises, determined to prove to Victoria and herself that she belonged in this high-pressure world. By night, her thoughts were consumed by the file she'd stumbled upon and the revelation that her mother, Evelyn Brooks, had once worked for the Morgans. Victoria's words lingered in her mind. "Be careful where your curiosity takes you." Samantha couldn't decide if it was genuine advice or a veiled warning. Either way, it only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. The opportunity to broach the subject again came unexpectedly. Late one evening, as Samantha finished organizing Victoria's schedule for the week, she noticed the lights still on in Victoria's office. It wasn't unusual for her boss to work late, but tonight there was a different energy in the air. Quieter, more introspective. Samantha hesitated, unsure if she should disturb her, but then she spotted the faint glow of a half-empty glass of wine on Victoria's desk. Taking a deep breath, Samantha knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Ms. Morgan, is there anything else you need before I leave?" Victoria looked up from her papers, her expression softer than usual. She gestured for Samantha to come in. "Close the door behind you." Samantha obeyed, her nerves prickling as she stepped inside. Victoria motioned toward one of the leather chairs opposite her desk. "Sit." The atmosphere felt less formal than usual, but Samantha remained on edge. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying her for a moment before speaking. "You've been distracted lately," Victoria said, her tone direct but not accusatory. "Is it about what you found in that file?" Samantha blinked, surprised by the question. Yes," she admitted, deciding there was no point in denying it. "I've been trying to make sense of it. My mom never mentioned working for your family, and I can't stop wondering why." Victoria nodded slowly, swirling the wine in her glass. People often keep secrets to protect themselves, or others. The ambiguity of her statement only deepened Samantha's curiosity. "Do you think my mom left because something happened?" she asked cautiously. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "I can't say for sure, but the Morgans were complicated. My mother, in particular, had a way of getting what she wanted, sometimes at the expense of those around her." Samantha frowned, sensing a hint of bitterness in Victoria's voice. "What do you mean?" Victoria sighed, setting her glass down. "My mother was a formidable woman, brilliant, ambitious, but ruthless. She ran the household with the same precision she applied to the family business. It wouldn't surprise me if Evelyn left because of something my mother did." The admission startled Samantha. It was the most personal thing Victoria had ever shared with her, and it gave her a glimpse of the vulnerability hidden beneath her boss's polished exterior. "Did you and your mother get along?" Samantha asked, emboldened by Victoria's openness. Victoria let out a mirthless laugh. "Define get along. She loved me in her own way, I suppose, but her expectations were suffocating. She wanted me to be a reflection of her. Perfect. Untouchable. I spent most of my life trying to prove I could meet her standards, and even when I succeeded, it was never enough." Samantha felt a pang of sympathy. She had always assumed Victoria's confidence and success came effortlessly, but now she saw the cracks in the facade. "I'm sorry," Samantha said softly. "That sounds difficult." Victoria waved a hand dismissively. "We all have our crosses to bear, but enough about me." Her gaze sharpened, fixing on Samantha. "Why does this matter to you so much? What are you hoping to find?" Samantha hesitated, struggling to put her feelings into words. "I think it's because I never really knew my mom. She died when I was a teenager, and she never talked about her past. Finding out she worked for your family feels like a piece of the puzzle I've been missing. I just want to understand her better." Victoria's expression softened again, and for a moment, she looked almost wistful. "I understand the need for answers," she said quietly, "but be careful, Samantha. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than you expect." Over the next few days, Samantha's focus remained divided between her work and her quest for information about her mother. She scoured old employee records and combed through archived household logs, but the trail grew cold quickly. Frustration gnawed at her. Every discovery seemed to lead to more questions instead of answers. Then, one afternoon, a breakthrough came. Samantha was sorting through a stack of old photographs from the Morgan estate, part of a digitization project Victoria had assigned her, when she stumbled across an image that made her heart stop. It was a group photo of the household staff taken in the garden of the Morgan family's summer home. In the back row, standing slightly off to the side, was a younger version of her mother. Samantha stared at the photo, her hands trembling. Her mother looked happy, almost radiant, in a way Samantha hadn't seen since she was a little girl. But what caught her attention even more was the man standing beside Evelyn. He was tall, with dark hair and a confident smile. Something about him seemed familiar, though Samantha couldn't place why. She flipped the photo over, hoping for a label or date, and found a handwritten note. Morgan estate staff, 1998. Evelyn, Richard, Claire, Marcus, and the rest. Richard. Samantha's pulse quickened. Could he have been someone important to her mother? A friend? A romantic partner? The question swirled in her mind, and she knew she wouldn't rest until she found out. That evening, Samantha sat in her apartment, staring at the photo. It felt like a lifeline, a tangible connection to her mother's past. She traced her fingers over her mother's face, wondering what secrets she had taken to her grave. "I'll figure it out, Mom," Samantha whispered. "I promise." The weight of her resolve settled over her, steady and unshakable. Whatever the truth was, she was ready to uncover it. No matter what it revealed, the following morning began like any other. Samantha arrived early at Morgan Enterprises, her newfound determination lending her an extra burst of energy as she settled into her tasks for the day. But as she reviewed the company's schedules and prepared materials for Victoria's afternoon meeting, an uneasy buzz filled the air. Employees whispered in hushed tones, their faces taut with tension. Something was wrong. Samantha's instincts kicked in, and she hurried toward Victoria's office. Just as she reached the door, it swung open, revealing Victoria's executive assistant, an impeccably dressed man named Lucas, who looked visibly shaken. "Samantha?" he said urgently, gesturing her inside. "You need to see this." Victoria stood behind her massive desk, her phone pressed to her ear and her posture rigid. Samantha couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Victoria's clipped responses made it clear that she was in damage control mode. On the desk lay a tablet displaying what appeared to be a series of leaked documents. Victoria ended the call abruptly, her steely gaze locking onto Samantha. "Shut the door." Samantha obeyed, her pulse quickening. "What happened?" Victoria took a deep breath, her composure betraying only the slightest crack. "One of our rivals, the Darlington Group, has acquired confidential information about a key deal we've been negotiating. They're using it to undermine us with one of our largest clients." Samantha's stomach dropped. "But how did they get the information? I thought the security breach was contained." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "So did I, but clearly we missed something, or someone. The Darlington Group doesn't play fair, Samantha. They'll use any means necessary to sabotage us, and this is their boldest move yet." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. The Darlington Group's reputation as ruthless competitors was well known in the business world. They were infamous for bending, and often breaking, ethical boundaries to gain an edge. "What can I do to help?" Samantha asked, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Victoria handed her the tablet. "Go through these documents. Look for any inconsistencies, anything that could point to how they got this information. And keep your eyes open for internal leaks. We need to figure out who's feeding them before it's too late." Samantha spent the next few hours combing through the documents, her focus unshakable. The files contained sensitive details about Morgan Enterprises' financial projections, client strategies, and upcoming mergers. Information that could devastate the company if weaponized by the wrong hands, as she cross-referenced the leaked data with the company's internal records. A pattern began to emerge. One file in particular caught her attention. It was a client proposal that Samantha had seen before, but something about the wording seemed slightly off. She dug deeper, comparing it to the original document Victoria had approved weeks earlier. That's when she spotted it. a subtle alteration in the language that could only have been made after the final draft had been submitted. Someone on the inside had tampered with the file. Samantha's hands shook as she jotted down her findings and hurried to Victoria's office. She knocked briskly and entered, her heart racing as she placed the tablet on the desk. "I think I found something," she said, her voice firm. The leaked proposal was altered after the final draft. The changes matched the phrasing style of one of our junior executives in marketing, Erica Lang. Victoria's expression darkened, and she leaned forward to study the document. "Erica," she repeated, her tone icy. "She's been with us for less than a year." Samantha nodded. "Exactly. She doesn't have the same loyalty or history with the company as the rest of the team, and according to her profile, she worked for the Darlington Group before joining us." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's a connection I can't ignore." Within an hour, Victoria had convened a discreet meeting with her legal team and security consultants to investigate Erica Lang. The atmosphere in the office grew even more tense as word of the breach spread, though Victoria's inner circle kept the details tightly contained. Meanwhile, Samantha couldn't shake the weight of her role in uncovering Erica's potential betrayal. It felt surreal to be so deeply involved in a situation with stakes this high, but she also felt a growing sense of responsibility. Victoria had trusted her to help resolve this crisis, and Samantha was determined not to let her down. Later that evening, Samantha was finishing up her tasks when Lucas approached her desk. "Victoria wants to see you," he said, his expression unreadable. Samantha followed him to Victoria's office, where the CEO sat with an air of calm authority. The tension from earlier had been replaced by a sense of quiet resolve. "Sit," Victoria said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Samantha complied, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "We've confirmed your suspicions," Victoria said without preamble. "Erica Lang was indeed leaking information to the Darlington Group. She's been terminated, and our legal team is preparing to take further action." Relief flooded through Samantha. But Victoria wasn't finished. "Thanks to your diligence, we've contained the damage. The client has been informed of the situation, and they've assured us that their trust in Morgan Enterprises remains intact. But this was a close call. Closer than I'm comfortable with." Samantha nodded, unsure of how to respond. Victoria's piercing gaze softened slightly. "You did well," Victoria continued, "but this incident highlights just how vulnerable we are to internal threats. Going forward, I'll be relying on you to help implement stricter oversight measures. I trust you're up to the task." "I am," Samantha said firmly, her confidence growing. "Thank you for trusting me." Victoria leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You've earned it." As Samantha left the office that night, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had faced one of the most daunting challenges of her new role and come out stronger. But as she rode the train home, her thoughts drifted back to her mother and the mysteries surrounding her past. The day's victory was significant, but Samantha knew her journey was far from over. Some questions couldn't be answered in a boardroom, and Samantha was determined to find those answers, no matter where they led. The weekend offered Samantha a rare reprieve from the frenetic pace of Morgan Enterprises, but instead of relaxing, she found herself consumed by the photograph she'd discovered of her mother. She had spent hours staring at the faces in the picture, particularly the man labeled as Richard. His confident stance and proximity to Evelyn suggested a connection deeper than that of mere colleagues. Who was he, and what role had he played in her mother's life? Unable to shake the questions, Samantha decided to take action, armed with the photograph and the note scribbled on its back. She visited a local library that housed extensive archives on Chicago's history. If Richard had been associated with the Morgan family, there was a chance he might appear in public records or old news articles. The library's atmosphere was hushed, the scent of aged paper filling the air as Samantha sat at a microfilm reader. She scrolled through old articles, her eyes scanning for any mention of the Morgan estate or its staff. Hours passed, and frustration began to settle in. The trail seemed cold, until she stumbled upon a headline from 1998. "Fire devastates Morgan summer estate. 1 dead, several injured." Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she read the article. It detailed a fire that had destroyed a portion of the Morgan family's summer home, resulting in the death of a staff member. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a faulty electrical system, but the name of the deceased stopped Samantha cold. Richard Blake. The photograph in her bag suddenly felt heavier. Samantha's mind raced. Richard Blake was the man standing next to her mother in the photo. Could his death have been the reason Evelyn left the Morgans? Had the fire been more than an accident? Questions piled upon questions, and Samantha knew she needed answers. But she also knew there was only one person who might have them: Victoria. On Monday morning, Samantha arrived at the office with a mix of determination and apprehension. She wasn't sure how Victoria would react to her digging into the past, but she couldn't let fear stop her. Victoria was already in her office, reviewing a stack of reports, when Samantha knocked on the door. "Do you have a moment?" Samantha asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Victoria glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Come in." Samantha stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She hesitated for a moment, then placed the photograph on Victoria's desk. "I need to ask you about this." Victoria's eyes flicked to the photo, and for the first time since Samantha had started working for her, she saw a crack in Victoria's composure. Her jaw tightened, and her gaze lingered on the image for several seconds before she spoke. "Where did you find this?" Victoria asked, her tone low. "In the archives?" Samantha admitted. "I was digitizing old records, and it was in one of the boxes. That's my mom in the back row. And the man beside her, Richard Blake. I found out he died in a fire at your family's summer estate." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than Samantha had ever heard it. "Richard was complicated," Victoria said carefully. "He was part of the household staff, yes, but his role was more than that. He had a way of getting close to people, too close sometimes." "What do you mean?" Samantha asked, her brow furrowing. Victoria hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "My mother disapproved of him. She thought he was a distraction, but he was popular with the staff. And your mother, Evelyn, seemed particularly fond of him." Samantha's pulse quickened. "Do you think they were together?" "It's possible," Victoria admitted. "But if they were, they kept it quiet. My mother had a strict policy against fraternization among the staff. Anyone caught breaking the rules faced immediate dismissal." Samantha swallowed hard, her mind reeling. "Do you think that's why my mom left, because of Richard?" Victoria's gaze grew distant, her expression tinged with something that looked like regret. "It's likely Evelyn left shortly after the fire, and I always suspected there was more to the story than she let on. But I was young, and my mother controlled the household with an iron fist. If there were secrets, she would have buried them." Samantha felt a pang of frustration. The more she learned, the more elusive the truth became. "Do you think the fire was really an accident?" she asked quietly. Victoria's eyes snapped back to hers, sharp and piercing. "I've asked myself that question 100 times, but without evidence, speculation won't change anything." The conversation left Samantha with more questions than answers, but it also solidified her resolve. If the fire had forced her mother to leave, and if there was even a chance it hadn't been an accident, she needed to know. She decided to revisit the Morgan summer estate, hoping it might hold some clue that had been overlooked. Later that week, Samantha took a day off and made the drive to the outskirts of Chicago. Where the sprawling ruins of the Morgan summer home still stood, the estate was a shadow of its former self, the once grand structure reduced to crumbling walls and overgrown gardens. As Samantha walked through the remains, a sense of unease settled over her. The air felt heavy, as if the tragedy that had unfolded here still lingered. She found the charred remnants of what had once been the servants' quarters, the area most affected by the fire. Kneeling among the debris, she spotted something glinting in the dirt. Carefully, she unearthed it. A small, tarnished locket. Her breath hitched as she opened it to reveal 2 tiny photographs inside. One of her mother, Evelyn, and the other of Richard Blake. Samantha's heart pounded as she clutched the locket. This was it, proof of the connection between her mother and Richard. But the discovery raised even more questions. If her mother had been so close to Richard, why had she never spoken of him? And why had she hidden this part of her life from Samantha? As Samantha stood in the ruins, the weight of her discovery pressed down on her. She had uncovered a piece of her mother's past, but she knew it was only the beginning. The truth was buried deeper than she had ever imagined, and she was determined to dig it out, no matter what it cost. Samantha sat at her kitchen table that night, the locket lying in the palm of her hand like a weight she couldn't put down. The small, tarnished piece of jewelry held more than photographs. It held a secret her mother had kept buried for years, and it was now hers to uncover. The images of Evelyn and Richard inside the locket were intimate, their smiles warm and unguarded, hinting at a bond that went far beyond a casual acquaintance. She traced her finger over the faded portraits, her mind racing. Why hadn't her mother ever mentioned Richard? And why had she hidden this part of her life? Samantha felt a tangle of emotions: confusion, frustration, and an ache for the answers she would never hear directly from her mother. The memory of her visit to the Morgan summer estate lingered in her mind. The ruins had felt almost alive with the echoes of the past, as if they were trying to tell her something. The discovery of the locket only deepened her conviction that the fire hadn't been an accident. Someone, or something, had wanted the truth to stay buried. The next morning, Samantha arrived at Morgan Enterprises with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent most of the night researching Richard Blake, but details about his life were sparse. A few mentions in employee records and a brief obituary in a local paper were all she could find. There was no family listed, no known connections beyond his employment at the Morgan estate. It was as if he had been erased from history, determined to dig deeper. Samantha approached Victoria's office. The CEO was reviewing documents, her expression as focused as ever, but she looked up when Samantha entered. "Do you have a moment?" Samantha asked hesitantly. Victoria gestured for her to sit. "What is it?" Samantha hesitated, pulling the locket from her pocket and placing it on Victoria's desk. "I found this at the summer estate," she said softly. Victoria's eyes widened as she picked up the locket, her fingers brushing over the photographs inside. "I recognize this," she murmured. "My mother confiscated it once. I remember her saying it was inappropriate for staff to form attachments." Samantha frowned. Confiscated? Why would she do that? Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Because she believed that personal relationships among the staff undermined professionalism. She had strict rules, and she enforced them without exception. If Evelyn and Richard were involved, my mother wouldn't have tolerated it. Samantha felt a surge of anger on her mother's behalf. "That's awful. They weren't hurting anyone." "Perhaps not," Victoria admitted, setting the locket down. "But my mother was more concerned with appearances than fairness. She would have seen their relationship as a threat to the order she maintained." Samantha took a deep breath, trying to rein in her frustration. "Do you think the fire might have had something to do with them? Maybe someone was trying to cover up their relationship?" Victoria's expression darkened. "It's possible, but I can't imagine who would go to such lengths, or why." That evening, as Samantha sat at her desk reviewing client reports, a message from Lucas popped up on her screen. "Victoria wants you to organize her personal archives," she said, to start with the storage room on the 12th floor. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The storage room was rarely accessed, containing decades' worth of files and memorabilia from Victoria's personal and professional life. If there were more clues about her mother or Richard, they might be hidden there. She made her way to the 12th floor, where a dimly lit corridor led to a heavy metal door marked Archives. Inside, the room was cool and quiet, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and leather. Rows of shelves stretched to the ceiling, packed with boxes, binders, and file folders. It was overwhelming, but Samantha felt a flicker of excitement. Somewhere in this sea of documents lay the answers she sought. She started with a section labeled Estate Records, 1980s-2000s. Most of the files were mundane: expense reports, maintenance logs, and inventories. But as she moved deeper into the stacks, she found a box marked Incident Reports. Her pulse quickened as she opened the box. Inside were reports detailing accidents, thefts, and other incidents that had occurred on Morgan properties over the years. Near the bottom, she found a folder labeled Summer Estate Fire, 1998. Samantha sat down on the floor and opened the folder. The first page was an official fire department report, confirming that the blaze had started in the servants' quarters due to faulty wiring. But as she flipped through the pages, she found a handwritten memo that caught her attention. Suspected sabotage dismissed due to lack of evidence. No further investigation required. Samantha's breath hitched. Sabotage. Why had that possibility been dismissed so quickly? She dug deeper, finding notes from interviews with staff members who had been present during the fire. Most of them described hearing a loud noise shortly before the flames erupted, but none could identify the source. Her stomach churned as she read one final note at the bottom of the file. Housekeeper Evelyn Brooks resigned immediately following the incident. No statement provided. Samantha's hands trembled as she closed the folder. Her mother had been at the center of it all, and she'd left without explanation. The locket, the fire, the rushed resignation. It all pointed to something far more sinister than an accidental blaze. By the time Samantha returned to her apartment that night, she felt like she was carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of secrets. She laid the folder and the locket on her kitchen table, staring at them as if they might somehow reveal more, if she looked hard enough. She couldn't stop thinking about the memo mentioning sabotage. If someone had intentionally started the fire, who would have had the motive? And why would they target the servants' quarters specifically? Samantha knew she couldn't unravel this mystery alone. She needed allies, people who knew the Morgans' history and could help piece together the truth. But in the world of Morgan Enterprises, trust was a rare commodity. For now, she had only one choice: to keep digging, no matter where it led. The truth was buried somewhere, and Samantha wouldn't rest until she unearthed it. Samantha sat in her apartment, surrounded by papers and files from the Morgan archives, the locket glinting faintly under the dim kitchen light. Every piece of information she had uncovered so far only deepened the mystery surrounding the fire, her mother's sudden departure, and the life Evelyn had hidden from her. The note about suspected sabotage wouldn't leave her mind. Why had the investigation been dismissed so quickly? And why had her mother refused to give a statement before leaving the Morgans forever? Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that someone had wanted to keep the truth buried, and she was determined to find out why. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. Someone who understood the Morgans' inner workings better than she did. There was only one person who fit the bill: Victoria. The next morning, Samantha arrived at Morgan Enterprises earlier than usual. The office was still quiet, the buzz of the workday yet to begin. Victoria's door was slightly ajar, and Samantha could see her seated at her desk, already deep in thought as she reviewed documents. Samantha hesitated for a moment, wondering if she was overstepping, but then knocked lightly on the door. Victoria looked up, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Samantha. "Come in." Samantha stepped inside, clutching the folder of fire records she had found. "I need to talk to you about something," she began cautiously. Victoria gestured for her to sit, folding her hands on the desk. "I assume this is about the file you found in the archives?" Samantha nodded, placing the folder on the desk. "Yes, I've been going through it, and there's something that doesn't add up." Victoria opened the folder and scanned the documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she reached the memo about suspected sabotage, she frowned. "I remember the fire," she said quietly. "I was a teenager at the time, but it was chaotic. The servants' quarters were completely destroyed, and Richard's death cast a shadow over the entire household. Do you think it could have been sabotage?" Samantha asked, leaning forward. Victoria's gaze darkened. "I wouldn't put it past my mother's rivals. She had plenty of enemies, both in business and society. But if someone did sabotage the estate, it was buried quickly. My mother wouldn't have wanted the scandal to tarnish our family's reputation." Samantha frowned. "But why target the servants' quarters? What could they have gained from that?" Victoria shook her head. "That's what doesn't make sense. Unless..." She trailed off, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Unless what?" Samantha pressed. Victoria sighed, leaning back in her chair. Unless the target wasn't the estate itself, it could have been someone specific. Someone in the servants' quarters. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "Like Richard. Or your mother," Victoria said, her voice quiet but firm. "If Evelyn and Richard were involved in something they weren't supposed to be, something beyond a personal relationship, it's possible someone wanted to silence them." Samantha left Victoria's office with her mind racing. The idea that her mother might have been targeted was chilling, but it also made a twisted kind of sense. If Evelyn had known something, or been involved in something, that posed a threat to the Morgans or their rivals, it could explain why she had left so abruptly and never spoken of her time with the family. But what could her mother and Richard have been involved in? And who would have gone to such lengths to cover it up, determined to dig deeper? Samantha decided to revisit the people who had worked at the estate during the fire. The old interviews in the file provided a list of names, and she began reaching out to them one by one. Most of the former staff members had moved on, and some were hesitant to talk, but one name stood out: Claire Bennett, a former maid who had been close friends with Evelyn. Samantha met Claire in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The woman was in her late 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that sparkled with curiosity as Samantha introduced herself. "You're Evelyn's daughter," Claire said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "You look just like her." Samantha smiled faintly. "Thank you. I've been trying to learn more about her time at the Morgan estate, especially around the time of the fire. She never talked about it, and I found out she left shortly after it happened." Claire's expression grew somber. "That fire was a terrible thing, poor Richard. He didn't deserve what happened." "What do you mean?" Samantha asked, leaning forward. Claire hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. Richard was complicated. He was charming, but he had a way of getting himself into trouble. He got involved with the wrong people who didn't take kindly to his ambitions. "What kind of ambitions?" Samantha pressed. "He was trying to help Evelyn," Claire said softly. "She had plans to leave the estate, to start a new life somewhere far away. Richard was going to go with her, but before they could, something went wrong." "What went wrong?" Samantha asked, her pulse quickening. Claire shook her head. "I don't know the details, but I do know this. Evelyn was terrified after the fire. She wouldn't talk to anyone about what happened, not even me. She packed her things and left as soon as she could. I think she knew someone was watching her." The revelation sent a chill down Samantha's spine. "Do you think the fire was meant to scare her? Or worse?" Claire said grimly. "Whoever started that fire wanted to send a message, and I think Evelyn got it loud and clear." As Samantha left the cafe, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Her mother had been planning to leave the Morgans' employment with Richard, but something, or someone, had stopped them. The fire hadn't just been a tragedy, it had been a warning, and whatever secrets Evelyn had taken with her were now resurfacing, threatening to change everything Samantha thought she knew. For the first time, Samantha realized that uncovering the truth might come with consequences she wasn't prepared for, but it was too late to turn back now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and Samantha was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what it cost. Samantha's mind churned with thoughts as she rode the train back to her apartment. The cityscape blurred past the windows, but she barely noticed. Claire's words echoed in her ears. Whoever started that fire wanted to send a message. It wasn't just the fire itself that unsettled her. It was the implication that someone had deliberately put her mother's life in danger. Possibly to keep her silent, the weight of what she had uncovered pressed heavily on her chest. If Evelyn had been scared enough to leave everything behind, then Samantha was stepping into the very danger her mother had tried to escape. And yet, she couldn't stop. The truth wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It was about Samantha finding her own identity and understanding the legacy her mother had left behind. The next day at Morgan Enterprises, Samantha felt a strange energy in the air. The usual hum of activity in the office seemed heightened, almost charged with tension as she made her way to her desk. Lucas approached her, his expression tight. "Victoria wants you in her office," he said quietly. "Now?" Samantha's heart skipped a beat. "Did she say why?" Lucas shook his head. "She didn't have to. You'll understand when you see." Samantha hurried to Victoria's office, her nerves on edge. She knocked lightly before entering, and what she saw made her stop in her tracks. Victoria was standing behind her desk, her arms crossed, while two men in suits sat across from her. The tension in the room was palpable. "Ah, Samantha," Victoria said, her voice unusually calm. "Come in. I was just explaining to these gentlemen that you've been assisting me with reviewing some archival materials." Samantha frowned, unsure of where this was going. "Yes, that's right." One of the men turned to her, his dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm Detective Alvarado, and this is my partner, Detective Harris. We're reopening an investigation into the fire that occurred at the Morgan Summer Estate in 1998. We understand you've been looking into it as well." Samantha's stomach churned. She glanced at Victoria, who gave her a subtle nod, as if to say, "Answer carefully." "Yes," Samantha admitted, her voice steady. I've been trying to learn more about my mother's time working for the Morgans. She left shortly after the fire, and I found some records that raised questions. Detective Alvarado leaned forward. And what kind of questions would those be? Samantha hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much, especially in front of Victoria, but she couldn't lie outright. The fire report mentioned suspected sabotage, but the investigation was closed without further action. I also learned that my mother and Richard Blake, a member of the staff who died in the fire, had a close relationship. It made me wonder if there was more to the story. The detectives exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable. Harris spoke next. We've recently received new information suggesting that the fire may not have been an accident, and it seems your mother might have been a key witness. Samantha's breath caught. What kind of information? We can't disclose that, Alvarado said firmly, but we're looking into whether Richard Blake was involved in activities that could have made him a target. Do you know if your mother ever mentioned anything about Richard's dealings? Samantha shook her head. No, she never talked about that time in her life, but from what I've found, it seems like she was planning to leave the estate with Richard before the fire happened. Alvarado's gaze sharpened. Leave, together. Yes, Samantha said. They were close, and I think they were trying to start a new life away from the estate. But the fire changed everything. Victoria, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat. Detectives, if you believe this investigation could affect Morgan Enterprises, I would appreciate being kept informed. That fire was a tragedy, but I was a teenager at the time. My mother was the one managing the estate. Harris nodded. We're aware. We'll be in touch if we need further information. For now, we'd appreciate it if both of you refrained from discussing this matter with anyone outside this room. The detectives stood and left, leaving Samantha and Victoria alone. The silence was thick, and Samantha could feel the weight of Victoria's scrutiny. You handled that well, Victoria said finally, her tone neutral. But this investigation could complicate things, for both of us. Samantha frowned. Why? If they're reopening the case, it might finally bring us answers. Victoria shook her head. You don't understand. The Morgan name is already under constant scrutiny. If this investigation uncovers anything that implicates my family, it could damage everything I've built. Samantha stared at her, a mix of frustration and sympathy bubbling up. I'm not trying to hurt you, Victoria. I just want to know the truth about my mom. Victoria's gaze softened, just slightly. I know, but be careful, Samantha. Once the truth is out, you can't control what happens next. That evening, Samantha returned to her apartment, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. The detective's visit had added a new layer of urgency to her search. If they believed Richard had been involved in something dangerous, then her mother might have known more than she let on. And if Evelyn had been a witness, she could have been in more danger than Samantha had realized. Samantha pulled out her laptop and began researching Richard Blake again, this time focusing on his connections. It didn't take long to uncover a name that sent a chill down her spine. Darlington Group. The same Darlington Group that had tried to sabotage Victoria's company. Samantha's fingers hovered over the keyboard as the implications sank in. If Richard had been involved with Darlington, or if he had crossed them, it could explain why he was targeted. And if her mother had been caught in the crossfire, it would mean the danger wasn't just in the past. It was still lurking, waiting to resurface. As she stared at the screen, Samantha realized the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. The fire at the Morgan estate wasn't just a tragedy. It was part of a larger web of deceit, betrayal, and power, and Samantha was right in the middle of it. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her pulse pounding. The shadows of the past were beginning to take shape, and they were darker than she had ever anticipated. Samantha sat staring at the name on her screen, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Darlington Group. The connection between Richard Blake and Victoria's cutthroat rivals added a chilling new dimension to the mystery. If Richard had been involved with Darlington, then his death might not have been an accident at all. Worse, if Evelyn had known something or been involved herself, it explained why she had been so desperate to leave the Morgan estate. The idea that Darlington could still pose a threat wasn't just unsettling. It was terrifying. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a dangerous line, one where uncovering the truth could put her in the same danger her mother had tried to escape. She took a deep breath, pushing her fear aside. If Darlington had been involved back then, there had to be evidence somewhere, something to connect them to the fire and to Richard's death. Samantha was determined to find it. The next day, Samantha arrived at Morgan Enterprises with a plan. She needed access to Victoria's private records, specifically, anything related to Darlington. It was a bold move, and she knew it came with risks. But if there was any chance of finding answers, she had to take it. Victoria was in the middle of a meeting when Samantha approached Lucas at his desk. "I need access to the old corporate archives," Samantha said. Keeping her tone calm but firm, Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Why? It's related to the investigation," she said vaguely, hoping he wouldn't press for details. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but don't get caught up in anything you can't explain." Samantha gave him a tight smile. "I won't." The archives were a labyrinth of documents and records, spanning decades of Morgan Enterprises history. Samantha sifted through files, her focus narrowing to anything mentioning Darlington. At first, the search seemed fruitless, just old contracts and meeting minutes with no clear connection. But then she stumbled upon a folder labeled Darlington Negotiations, 1998. Her pulse quickened as she opened it. Inside were memos and correspondence between Victoria's mother and executives from the Darlington Group. The tone of the letters was tense, almost hostile, and it was clear that the two parties had been locked in a fierce competition over a lucrative property deal. One memo, in particular, caught Samantha's eye. It was dated just 2 weeks before the fire, and read, "We have reason to believe Darlington is engaging in underhanded tactics to secure the Willow Creek acquisition. Their representatives have been seen in proximity to our estate staff. Discretion is advised." Samantha's stomach churned. The memo hinted at a connection between Darlington and the Morgan estate staff, possibly Richard. If Darlington had approached him, it could explain why he became a target. As Samantha continued to sift through the folder, she found a note scribbled in the margin of another memo. Evelyn's involvement. Watch closely. Her breath caught. Evelyn's name, written in her mother's distinctive handwriting, stood out starkly against the otherwise professional documents. But why had her mother written it? And why had she been keeping tabs on Evelyn? That evening, Samantha couldn't shake the weight of her discoveries. She sat in her apartment, the memos spread out on the table alongside the locket and the photograph of her mother and Richard. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they painted was darker than she had imagined. Her mother and Richard had been planning to leave the Morgan estate, likely to escape whatever schemes Darlington had drawn them into. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate act to silence them, or scare them into submission. And Evelyn, knowing the danger, had chosen to leave everything behind to protect herself and Samantha. But the more Samantha thought about it, the more questions emerged. Why had her mother kept all of this a secret? And why was the investigation being reopened now, decades later? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitantly, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. "Victoria!" Samantha opened the door, surprised to see her boss standing there, looking as composed as ever despite the late hour. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" Victoria stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the table. Her gaze lingered on the memos and the locket, and a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed her face. "We need to talk," Victoria said, her tone serious. "About what you found." Samantha gestured for her to sit. "How did you know?" "Lucas told me you were in the archives," Victoria said, taking a seat. "And I've been keeping tabs on the investigation. I knew you wouldn't stop digging." Samantha sat across from her, her nerves on edge. "I think Richard was involved with Darlington," she said bluntly. "And my mom knew. That's why they were trying to leave." Victoria nodded slowly. "That aligns with what I've suspected, but it goes deeper than that." "What do you mean?" Samantha asked, leaning forward. Victoria hesitated, her eyes narrowing. Richard wasn't just a member of the staff. He was passing information to Darlington, using his position to gain access to sensitive details about my mother's business deals. Samantha's heart sank. "So he was a spy?" "Yes," Victoria said, "but I don't think Evelyn was part of it. From what I've pieced together, Richard used their relationship to cover his tracks. He thought he could leave the estate and disappear before anyone found out. Samantha felt a surge of anger, but my mom paid the price. The fire was a warning, wasn't it? To make sure they stayed quiet. Victoria's expression hardened. It wasn't just a warning. It was an execution. Richard knew too much, and someone decided he was a liability. Samantha stared at her, the weight of the truth settling over her. Her mother had been caught in the crossfire of a battle she hadn't chosen. A battle between two powerful forces who valued money and power over human lives. "I think the same people who started the fire are still out there," Victoria said quietly, "and they won't hesitate to act again if they think we're getting too close to the truth." Samantha's blood ran cold. For the first time, she realized that the danger wasn't just in the past. It was here, in the present. And it was closing in. The revelation left Samantha speechless. The truth was darker than she had anticipated. Her mother's connection to Richard, his betrayal, and the fire that had taken his life were no longer just fragments of a distant past. They were part of a web of deceit that still held the power to destroy. Victoria's voice cut through the tense silence. "We're not safe, Samantha. If Darlington was involved back then, and if they suspect we're digging into it now, they'll act to protect their secrets." Samantha swallowed hard. "But why now? It's been decades. Why reopen this?" Victoria's expression was grim. "Darlington has always had its eyes on us. Every step Morgan Enterprises takes. They're there, waiting to exploit any weakness. If reopening the investigation creates instability or tarnishes our name, they'll use it to their advantage." Samantha felt the weight of her discoveries press against her chest. "So you think this investigation is part of their plan?" Victoria nodded. "It's likely. If they can tie your mother, or me, to Richard's activities, they'll discredit us. And given how much is at stake, they won't stop there." The conversation left Samantha restless that night. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with questions and fears. If Darlington was still pulling strings, who could she trust? And how far would they go to keep the truth hidden? By morning, Samantha had made up her mind. She couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. If Darlington was trying to manipulate the situation, she needed to get ahead of them. But she would need help. Someone who could connect the pieces she couldn't. Her first stop was Claire Bennett. Samantha met Claire at the same small cafe where they had spoken before. Claire's eyes widened in surprise when Samantha placed the Darlington memos on the table. "This," Samantha said, pointing to the memo mentioning Evelyn's involvement, "proves that Darlington had a hand in what happened at the estate." Claire scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. "I knew Richard was involved with something, but I never imagined it went this deep. If Evelyn knew about this, no wonder she was terrified." "Do you remember anything else about the fire?" Samantha asked. "Anything that could explain why it happened?" Claire sighed, shaking her head. "I wish I did. All I remember is the chaos. The fire spread so quickly, and everyone was scrambling to get out. Richard's room was closest to where the flames started. Some people thought he was targeted, but no one wanted to say it out loud." Samantha frowned. "Did Evelyn ever mention anyone threatening her? Or Richard?" "No," Claire said. "But looking back, she was more on edge in the weeks before the fire. She started avoiding certain people, especially Mr. Darlington himself." "Wait," Samantha interrupted. "Darlington was at the estate." Claire nodded. "He visited often back then, though I never knew why. He and your mother had a few tense conversations. She never told me what they were about, but I could tell they weren't friendly." A cold chill ran down Samantha's spine. If Darlington had been personally involved, it changed everything. This wasn't just corporate sabotage, it was personal. Back at Morgan Enterprises, Samantha shared her findings with Victoria. The CEO listened intently, her expression unreadable as Samantha recounted Claire's story. "So Darlington himself was at the estate," Victoria said, her voice measured. "That explains a lot." Samantha nodded. "If he was involved, it would make sense that he wanted to erase any loose ends. Richard and my mom must have been a threat to whatever he was doing." Victoria leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. "This confirms my worst fears. Darlington's reach isn't just professional, it's personal. And if he's been watching us this whole time, he's already one step ahead. What do we do?" Samantha asked, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. "We go on the offensive," Victoria said firmly. Darlington thrives on secrecy. If we expose what he's done, we strip him of his power. Samantha hesitated. But what about the investigation? If the detectives find out about my mom's connection to Richard, it could ruin everything. Victoria's gaze softened slightly. Samantha, your mother's actions don't define you, or her. From what you've uncovered, it's clear she was caught in something far bigger than herself. The fire wasn't her fault. Samantha nodded, her resolve hardening. Then let's make sure Darlington doesn't get away with this. The next step was risky but necessary. Samantha and Victoria began compiling everything they had on Darlington. Memos, employee records, and old contracts. They worked late into the night, piecing together a timeline of events that painted a damning picture of Darlington's tactics. The evidence wasn't definitive, but it was enough to raise serious questions. As they worked, Samantha couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for Victoria. Despite her icy exterior, it was clear that she was deeply invested in protecting not just her company, but also Samantha for the first time. Samantha saw her not just as a boss, but as an ally. You know, Victoria said suddenly, breaking the silence, your mother would be proud of you. Samantha looked up, surprised. Why do you say that? Because you're brave, Victoria said simply. You're not afraid to face the truth, even when it's painful. That takes strength. Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed it down. Thank you, she said softly. The following day, Samantha received an unexpected call. It was Detective Alvarado. We've made progress on the investigation, he said, his tone serious. And I think you're going to want to see this. Samantha's heart raced. What is it? Evidence, Alvarado said, that ties Darlington to the fire. Samantha's breath caught. When can I see it? Come by the station this afternoon, Alvarado said. But be careful, Miss Brooks. If Darlington's behind this, he won't let it go quietly. As Samantha hung up, she felt a surge of both fear and determination. The truth was finally within reach, but the danger was closer than ever. Samantha arrived at the police station that afternoon, her heart pounding in her chest. Detective Alvarado met her at the entrance, his demeanor calm, but his eyes carrying a weight that matched the situation's gravity. He led her to a small, windowless room where a stack of documents and a laptop sat on the table. We've been working through old records, Alvarado began, gesturing for Samantha to take a seat. It took some digging, but we found this. He opened a file and slid it across the table toward her. Samantha leaned forward, her eyes scanning the contents. The file contained a series of financial transactions dated shortly before the fire at the Morgan Summer estate. The name that appeared most frequently in the records made her stomach drop. Richard Blake. These payments were made to Richard, Alvarado explained, pointing to the figures. All of them from accounts linked to the Darlington Group. Samantha's throat tightened. So he was on their payroll. Looks that way, Alvarado said. But it's more than that. The amounts suggest he wasn't just a low-level informant. He was being paid for something significant. Samantha's mind raced as she tried to process the information. But why would Darlington want him dead if he was working for them? Wouldn't they want to protect him? Alvarado frowned. Not if he became a liability. It's possible Richard double-crossed them or tried to back out of whatever arrangement they had. People like Darlington don't tolerate betrayal. Samantha flipped to another page in the file, which detailed communications between Darlington executives. One email in particular stood out. If Blake can't deliver, he's useless to us. Handle it before it becomes a bigger problem. Her breath caught. They ordered the fire, didn't they? Alvarado nodded grimly. That's what it looks like. They used the fire to eliminate him and send a message to anyone else who might have been thinking of crossing them. Samantha's hands trembled as she closed the file. And my mom? Do you think they were after her too? It's possible, Alvarado admitted. If Evelyn knew about Richard's dealings, or if she tried to intervene, they might have seen her as a threat. But it seems she left before they could act on it. Samantha sat back in her chair, the weight of the truth settling over her. Her mother hadn't just been a witness to the fire. She had been caught in the crossfire of a ruthless power play, forced to flee to protect herself and Samantha. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alvarado's expression hardened. We keep digging. This is enough to implicate Darlington in the fire. But we'll need more to bring charges against them. And we'll need to move carefully. If they suspect we're onto them, they'll try to shut us down. Samantha nodded, her resolve solidifying. I'll do whatever it takes to help. That evening, Samantha returned to Morgan Enterprises to share what she had learned with Victoria. The CEO was in her office, her expression tense as she reviewed documents on her computer. She looked up when Samantha entered, her sharp gaze softening slightly at the sight of her assistant. "Tell me you have good news," Victoria said. Samantha placed the file from the detectives on Victoria's desk. "We have proof that Darlington paid Richard Blake, and that they ordered the fire to eliminate him." Victoria's eyes widened as she scanned the documents, her expression shifting from surprise to cold fury. "So it was them," she said quietly. "I always suspected, but this confirms it." Samantha hesitated. "There's more. The detectives think my mom might have been a target too. If she knew about Richard's dealings, they would have seen her as a threat." Victoria's jaw tightened, and she leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped together. "Your mother was braver than anyone gave her credit for. She must have known the risks. But she chose to protect you instead of staying silent." The words hit Samantha harder than she expected. For years, she had resented her mother's secrecy. But now she understood that Evelyn's silence had been an act of love, a way to shield Samantha from the darkness of the past. "We need to act," Samantha said, her voice firm. "We can't let Darlington get away with this." Victoria nodded, her expression resolute. "Agreed, but we need to be strategic. Darlington's power lies in their ability to operate in the shadows. If we expose them, we strip them of that power." Over the next few days, Samantha and Victoria worked tirelessly to piece together a case against Darlington. They compiled every document, memo, and financial record they could find, creating a timeline of events that painted a damning picture of the group's actions. Samantha worked late into the night, fueled by a mix of anger and determination. But as the case grew stronger, so did the risks. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She noticed unfamiliar cars parked near her apartment, and strange phone calls that ended as soon as she answered. The paranoia was creeping in, but she couldn't afford to let it stop her. The breakthrough came when Victoria received an anonymous tip, a folder of documents left on her desk, detailing more of Darlington's covert operations. Among them was a list of names, individuals who had been silenced, coerced, or destroyed by the group. Richard's name was there, as was Evelyn's. The list was a chilling testament to Darlington's ruthlessness, but it was also the final piece of evidence they needed. "This is it," Victoria said, her voice steely as she reviewed the documents. "This is how we bring them down." Samantha stared at the names, her heart aching for the lives that had been lost or destroyed. But as she looked at her mother's name, she felt a flicker of hope. Evelyn's story wouldn't end in silence. Samantha would make sure the world knew the truth. "We need to go public," Samantha said. "Expose everything," Victoria nodded. "And we will, but we'll do it on our terms." The plan was set. The next step would be the most dangerous yet. But Samantha was ready to face it head-on. The shadows of the past were finally being brought into the light, and Darlington's reign of fear was about to come to an end. The day had finally come, the culmination of weeks of investigation, sleepless nights, and unrelenting determination had brought Samantha and Victoria to this pivotal moment. The evidence they had collected, the memos, the financial records, the anonymous tip, was enough to expose the Darlington Group's dark secrets. But the cost of getting here weighed heavily on Samantha's mind. The truth had already changed her life irrevocably, and there was no turning back now. Victoria had arranged a press conference, a calculated move to take control of the narrative before Darlington could react. The room at Morgan Enterprises headquarters was packed with journalists, cameras, and industry insiders. Samantha stood behind the scenes, clutching a folder of documents, her heart pounding as the reality of what they were about to do sank in. Victoria, calm and composed as ever, adjusted the microphone at the podium. She glanced back at Samantha, giving her a subtle nod of reassurance before addressing the room. "Good morning," Victoria began, her voice steady. "I've called this press conference to share important information regarding events that have affected not only Morgan Enterprises, but also the integrity of our industry as a whole. Today, we are exposing a pattern of unethical practices carried out by the Darlington Group. Practices that have caused irreparable harm to countless individuals." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the weight of Victoria's words sinking in. For decades, Darlington has operated in the shadows, using intimidation, bribery, and, as you'll soon see, far worse methods to secure their interests. We have evidence linking them to multiple instances of sabotage, coercion, and even violence. But perhaps the most egregious example is their involvement in the 1998 fire at the Morgan Summer estate, a fire that claimed the life of Richard Blake, a member of our staff, and forced others, including Evelyn Brooks, into silence. At the mention of her mother's name, Samantha felt a surge of emotion. Victoria's words weren't just exposing Darlington's actions. They were vindicating Evelyn's sacrifices. The presentation that followed was meticulously planned. Victoria laid out the evidence step by step, each document and piece of testimony painting a clearer picture of Darlington's corruption. Samantha's role was to handle the technical aspects, ensuring the slides and video clips displayed seamlessly. But as she worked, her mind kept drifting to the weight of what they were revealing. When the email implicating Darlington in the fire was displayed on the screen, the room went silent. The journalists leaned forward, their pens poised over notebooks, as Victoria delivered the final blow. "This email," Victoria said, her voice unwavering, "proves that the fire was no accident. It was a deliberate act, ordered by the Darlington Group to eliminate Richard Blake, who had been working as an informant for them. The fire was not only a tragedy but a calculated move to silence anyone who posed a threat to their agenda." The crowd erupted with questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock and outrage. Victoria held up a hand, commanding silence. "We are pursuing legal action against the Darlington Group," she said. "This ends today." As the press conference concluded, Samantha felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They had taken a monumental step, but she knew the fight was far from over. Darlington wouldn't go down without a fight. Back in Victoria's office, the atmosphere was tense but triumphant. Victoria poured herself a glass of water, her composure finally giving way to a small, satisfied smile. "We did it," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's out there," Samantha nodded, her hands still trembling. "Do you think it'll be enough?" "It's a start," Victoria said. "But Darlington won't sit quietly. They'll try to discredit us, spin the narrative in their favor. We need to be prepared." Samantha hesitated. "What if they come after us?" "After me?" Victoria's gaze softened. "They won't. Not after today. The spotlight is on them now, and they know any move they make will be scrutinized. You're safe, Samantha." The words were reassuring, but Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't entirely over. Later that evening, Samantha returned to her apartment, emotionally drained but unable to relax. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the locket that had started it all. The photographs of her mother and Richard seemed to hold new meaning now, a reminder of the courage it took to stand against something so powerful. A knock at the door startled her. Samantha tensed, her mind flashing to Victoria's warning about Darlington's potential retaliation. She hesitated, then cautiously approached the door. To her relief, it was Detective Alvarado. "Detective," she said, opening the door. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you'd want to hear this in person," Alvarado said. Stepping inside, he held up a file. "We just received a tip. Anonymous, like the one you and Victoria got. It's enough to launch a full-scale investigation into Darlington." Samantha's eyes widened. "What kind of tip?" "Bank records, communications, internal memos. Whoever sent this has access to everything," Alvarado said. "It's enough to put Darlington executives behind bars." Relief flooded through Samantha. For the first time, it felt like justice was truly within reach. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The legal case against Darlington gained momentum, with new evidence surfacing almost daily. The media coverage was relentless, and public opinion quickly turned against the once powerful corporation. Executives were arrested, assets were frozen, and the company's reputation crumbled. Through it all, Samantha felt a quiet sense of vindication. Her mother's story was no longer hidden in the shadows. Evelyn Brooks's name had been cleared, and her courage was finally recognized. One evening, as the dust began to settle, Samantha visited the Morgan estate. The ruins of the summer home were quiet. The overgrown gardens bathed in the golden light of sunset. She stood where the servants' quarters had once been, clutching the locket in her hand. "Mom," she said softly, her voice carrying in the stillness. I found the truth. They didn't win. For the first time in weeks, Samantha felt a sense of peace. The truth had cost her, but it had also given her a newfound strength. She had faced the shadows of the past and emerged stronger, ready to shape her own future. As she walked away from the ruins, Samantha knew one thing for certain. The darkness might linger, but the light of the truth would always shine brighter.